She fired him in front of cameras, reporters, and her entire board. He handed back his keys without a word. But before he walked away, he said 4 words she should have listened to. Don't use the front entrance. She didn't. And in the 12 seconds that followed, the quiet man she'd just humiliated in front of Chicago's most powerful people became the only reason she survived the morning. Problem wasn't that Sabrina Westbrook fired the wrong man. Problem was what that man knew and what he'd already seen coming for weeks that no one had allowed him to tell her. Before we go further, if you've never been to this channel before, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. We tell stories here that stay with you. Real human drama. Stories about people who get overlooked, underestimated, and counted out, and what happens when the world finally sees who they actually are. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling us your city and your country. We want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that morning in Chicago. The Sterling Crest Hotel stood at the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Ambition, 42 floors of glass and steel that caught the October light and threw it back in every direction like a dare. It was the kind of building that made people straighten their posture when they pulled up in front of it, even if they'd been there 100 times. The doorman wore white gloves. The lobby smelled like imported flowers and old money. Everything about it was designed to communicate one thing: whatever you're carrying in here had better be worth the space. Sabrina Westbrook had been carrying quite a lot. At 30 years old, she'd built Westbrook Capital City from a 2-person consulting firm into a company that managed north of $400 million in assets, with offices in Chicago, New York, and one that had just opened, somewhat optimistically, in Singapore. The merger she was weeks away from closing with Ardmore Financial Group, an institutional giant headquartered in Boston, would push that number past $1 billion. It would also make her, by most measures, one of the youngest female CEOs to reach that threshold, without inheriting the company from someone else. She had built it, every painful, sleepless, doubt-saturated inch of it. She knew what the morning's investor meeting meant. She also knew what it would cost her if something went wrong. That was the weight she was carrying when she came downstairs from her hotel suite at 7:48. Travis Hollowell had been awake since 4:30. That wasn't unusual. He was almost always awake before the alarm, lying in the dark of his studio apartment on the north side, the kind of stillness that most people couldn't manage even when they were trying. It wasn't peace exactly. It was more like habit, the habit of a man who had spent years in environments where sleep was a vulnerability, and silence was something you paid attention to. He'd worked hard to shed most of those instincts after he left the Navy. Some of them had been harder to lose than others. He made coffee. He scrambled eggs and cut up half an apple, which he left on a small plate beside a folded napkin on the table because Maisie would be up in an hour, and she always ate better when the food was already there waiting for her. His daughter was 8 years old and had strong opinions about breakfast. She required the apple to be cut in thin slices, not chunks, and she preferred her eggs without pepper, which Travis sometimes forgot. He never forgot anymore. He'd been doing this alone for 2 years. Since the accident on the I-90 that took Carla from both of them on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when Maisie was 6, and Travis had just started the driver's job at Westbrook. The timing was awful in the way that truly bad things are always awful. Right when you think you've found stable ground, right when you've convinced yourself the hard part is behind you. He'd stayed at the job because it was steady, and the hours were predictable enough that he could arrange after-school care for Maisie without too much difficulty. He wasn't interested in advancement. He wasn't looking for recognition. He showed up, he drove, he was quiet and reliable, and he went home to his daughter. That was the shape of his life, and he had accepted it. What he had not accepted was the thing he'd found 3 weeks ago, a pattern of small, almost imperceptible signs that something around Sabrina Westbrook's security was wrong. He'd submitted 2 internal reports through proper channels. Neither had received a response. He'd tried a 3rd time, tagging the security chief directly. That one disappeared too. This morning at 5:15, when he went down to the building's underground garage to do his pre-trip check on the company vehicle, a black Mercedes S-Class that he'd driven Sabrina in for 18 months without incident, he found it. It was tucked up inside the rear wheel well, magnetized to the frame, about the size of a thick credit card. He recognized the hardware immediately, not because he'd seen the exact model before, but because he understood what it was and who used things like it. This wasn't commercial off the shelf. It wasn't a spouse worried about a cheating partner. The encryption signature on the unit's indicator light told him it was syncing to something active, something that was receiving a live signal. He stood there in the garage for a moment, crouched beside the rear wheel, the fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead, and made his decision. He removed the device. He photographed it from 4 angles with his phone. He bagged it in a spare Ziploc he kept in his kit because he was, among other things, a man who thought ahead. And then he took the stairs back up to the lobby at a pace that cost him exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes. He would spend the rest of the day measuring what those 3 minutes cost him. Sabrina came through the corridor from the elevator bank at 7:48, and she was already running the meeting in her head. She had her phone in one hand and a coffee from the room in the other, and she was walking the way she always walked when something important was about to happen, at exactly the pace that said, "I am not rushing. Everything is under control," even when it wasn't. Her assistant, Audrey Lennox, was half a step behind her, carrying a leather portfolio and a backup phone charger, and a look of careful attention that Audrey had perfected over 3 years of working for Sabrina. Darren Voss was already in the lobby. He was the kind of man who made sure he was always already in the lobby. 45, well-built, with silver at his temples, and the particular confidence of someone who had never seriously been questioned by the people who paid him. He'd been Westbrook's head of security for 4 years. He dressed better than most security professionals' tailored suits, good watches, and he had a manner about him that made people feel as though they were being taken care of, even when nothing was actually happening. Sabrina trusted him. He'd been recommended by 2 board members she respected, and he'd never given her a visible reason to doubt him. He was standing near the entrance with 2 of his team when Sabrina appeared, and his face shifted into the composed, attentive expression he always wore when she arrived. Somewhere. "Good morning," he said. "Car's out front." Sabrina nodded, scanning the lobby briefly. "Where's Travis?" Darren's expression didn't change in any obvious way. Something behind his eyes did, but only for a fraction of a second. "Not here yet." She checked her phone. 7:49. "He's late," she said, not a question. 3 minutes, Darren confirmed, and there was something in his tone, barely anything, almost nothing, that planted the word incompetent without actually saying it. The lobby was not empty. There were 2 journalists from financial publications who'd been cleared for brief pre-meeting access, and they were positioned near the entrance with small notebooks and the practiced look of people paid to notice things. There were 3 board members in conversation near the concierge desk. Audrey, who was watching Darren carefully and not saying anything. And there were, in total, perhaps 15 or 16 people who would later, when asked, confirm that they had witnessed what happened next. Travis came through the side entrance at 7:51. He was moving quickly, but not running a controlled pace, the kind that eats up distance without announcing panic. He had the Ziploc bag in his jacket pocket. He opened his mouth to speak. Darren stepped forward. "You're late," Darren said. His voice was just loud enough. Calibrated, Travis thought later. Not shouting. Just loud enough to carry. "I need to speak with Miss Westbrook directly," Travis said. He was looking at Sabrina, not at Darren. "You're 3 minutes late for a critical departure," Darren said. "That's not a conversation. That's a problem. There was something on the vehicle." Travis's voice was even. "I need 60 seconds." Sabrina felt the pressure of the room on her, the journalists, the board members, the morning that had to go perfectly, and underneath it, a flicker of something else. Something that she would later identify as the moment she should have stopped and listened. She didn't stop. "Darren handles security concerns," she said. "Ms. Westbrook, I'm not going to be late to this meeting because my driver mismanaged his schedule." She heard the sharpness in her own voice and didn't pull it back. "This is your job, Mr. Hollowell. One job." Darren filled the pause that followed. "Ms. Westbrook, with the level of today's meeting, this kind of unreliability isn't something we can afford." And Sabrina Westbrook, who was exhausted and scared and carrying $1 billion morning on her 30-year-old shoulders, in front of cameras and colleagues and people she needed to impress, made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of the year. "You're done," she said. "Turn in your credentials." The lobby went quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when something irreversible has just happened. Travis held her gaze for a moment. Just a moment. He reached into his pocket, removed his key fob, and placed it on the concierge desk beside him. He didn't argue. He didn't appeal. He didn't look at Darren at all, which Audrey noticed and filed away in the part of her mind that was always filing things away. He turned to leave. Then he stopped. He looked back at Sabrina. His voice was quiet, not cold, not wounded, just quiet in the way that serious things are quiet. Don't use the front entrance. Sabrina blinked. Excuse me? He was already walking toward the side exit. She watched him go, with a sensation she couldn't immediately name, and then Darren said something about the car being ready, and the morning reassembled itself around her, and she let it. She used the front entrance. Of course she did. The revolving doors pushed her out onto the sidewalk and into October, where the light was sharp and cold and the street smelled like exhaust and coffee from a cart on the corner. Her security detail, 2 of Darren's men flanked her at what looked like the appropriate distance. The Mercedes was at the curb. A small cluster of photographers had positioned themselves across the street, angling for a shot of the merger morning arrival. Everything looked correct. That was the thing about professional surveillance, not the amateur kind, not the desperate kind, but the practice kind. It looked correct, right up until it didn't. Sabrina had taken 4 steps toward the car when she registered them. 3 of them. 2 men and a woman, positioned in the loose triangle formation that meant nothing to most people, but that Travis Hollowell had been watching for in environments considerably more dangerous than a Chicago hotel entrance. The woman was pretending to consult her phone. The man on the left was watching the street with the particular stillness of someone who has been trained not to move naturally. The third was closest to the vehicle, close enough that when the black SUV that materialized from the side street began its slow, deliberate arc toward the curb, he could have bridged the gap between her and its open door in under 2 seconds. Darren's 2 security men had taken 3 steps to either side, away from her. Later, reviewing the footage, Audrey would mark the exact frame. None of this registered consciously in the second. Sabrina felt the wrongness of it. It hit her more as a physical sensation, a cold drop in the stomach, the animal knowledge that the geometry of the moment was not right. She slowed without meaning to. The voice came from behind her, already moving. Get behind me, she spun. Travis was there. He had not left. He had gone to the side exit and then stopped, because a man who spent 6 years doing what Travis had done does not ignore a tracking device on a vehicle and then simply drive away into his day. He had been watching from the side entrance and he had seen the triangle close, and he had already crossed the distance. What happened in the next 8 seconds was difficult to reconstruct accurately because it moved faster than civilian eyes process it. The closest analogy Audrey could find later was footage she'd seen of water breaking around an object not violent exactly, but total, and with a kind of efficiency that looked almost bored. Travis moved Sabrina behind him with one arm, and the placement was so certain, so unhesitating that she went without resistance. The man nearest her reached, and Travis neutralized the reach with something that ended with the man face down on the sidewalk without any apparent intermediate steps. The woman with the phone lunged, and Travis was already somewhere else, and then she wasn't lunging anymore. The third man, near the car, had a half-second to recalibrate and didn't use it well. The SUV's passenger door swung open. Travis's hand was already on the doorframe, pushing it shut. The whole thing was over by the time Darren's men had turned back around. Sabrina stood behind Travis on the sidewalk of Michigan Avenue, with her heart slamming against her ribs and October air burning in her throat. The photographers were still going. One of them had started recording video on a second device and hadn't stopped. Travis stood with his back to her, scanning, assessing. His breathing was barely elevated. He had a small cut on his left hand that he hadn't appeared to notice. Then he crouched beside the nearest downed attacker, the man who had reached for Sabrina first, and checked the man's jacket. He moved with the deliberate care of someone who has done this before, who knows exactly where to look and what he is looking for. He stood up. In his hand was a small rectangular device, slightly smaller than the one he'd removed from the car's wheel well. Same housing, same indicator light, the same encryption signature pulsing faintly against the morning. He turned. Sabrina was still standing where he'd placed her. Her coffee was on the sidewalk. She didn't remember dropping it. Travis held up the device. He held up the photograph on his phone beside it, the one he'd taken in the parking garage at 517 that morning, 45 minutes before she'd fired him in front of her board, and a journalist and a man who had known exactly where to stand to hear every word. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything that small. He said they weren't improvising. Sabrina looked at him, then at the device, then at the chaos that was beginning to descend on the sidewalk as bystanders processed what they'd seen and started reaching for their phones, and a police siren went audible somewhere to the north. She said, "What does that mean?" Travis looked across the lobby entrance toward where Darren Voss was standing very still, watching them, with an expression that had no particular name. It means they knew your schedule, Travis said. Your vehicle. Your route, your exact departure window. He paused. Someone told them. He looked at Sabrina one more time. Someone who knew before I found the device and before you fired me. He pocketed his phone. The police car was 2 blocks out now, the siren getting louder. The morning was completely off its rails. The investor meeting already lost. The carefully constructed facade of a smooth and controlled CEO crumbling at the foundation, and standing at the center of it, Travis Hollowell, the driver she had dismissed like an inconvenience, was the only person on the sidewalk who looked like he'd expected all of this. Sabrina opened her mouth, closed it. She looked at the device in his hand, and then at the matching photograph, and then at the 3 people on the sidewalk who were only now beginning to stir, and then, almost involuntarily, across the entrance to where Darren Voss stood, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and that expression she still couldn't name. The first police cruiser pulled up. Travis stood quietly beside her in the cold morning light, the cut on his hand leaving a faint smear on the plastic of the evidence bag he'd produced from his kit to properly secure the device. He wasn't performing. He wasn't waiting for gratitude. He was watching the street with the patient, practiced attention of a man who understood that whatever had just happened was not, by a significant margin, over. Sabrina said quietly, so that only he could hear, "You knew this morning." Travis didn't look at her. "I tried to tell you." She had no answer for that. The October wind moved through the entrance and scattered one of the photographer's press badges across the sidewalk, and the police were out of their car now, and the morning that was supposed to make Sabrina Westbrook a billionaire had become something else entirely. Standing beside a man she'd fired 2 hours ago, whose name she'd barely learned in 18 months of daily rides, Sabrina Westbrook understood with the particular clarity that comes only after something has already gone wrong that she had never actually seen the person driving her car. She had seen a uniform, a schedule, a function. She had never once looked at the man. Police took 4 hours. That was the part no one told you about. When something like this happened in front of a 5-star hotel on Michigan Avenue, not the chaos itself, which moved fast and loud and had its own terrible momentum, but the long, grinding stillness that followed it. Statements, photographs, evidence bags, detectives who ask the same questions in slightly different configurations to see if your answers changed. The medical examiner's assistant who showed up because one of the 3 attackers had hit the pavement badly enough to require a hospital, which meant paperwork, which meant more waiting. Sabrina sat in a private meeting room on the Sterling Crest 2nd floor and answered questions for 90 minutes while her investor meeting dissolved somewhere on the other side of her phone screen in a series of polite, then less polite, then final-sounding emails. The Ardmore financial representatives had been patient for 40 minutes, then rescheduled, then gone quiet in a way that felt like a door closing without slamming. She read the last email 3 times and then put her phone face down on the table. Audrey sat across from her, the leather portfolio still in her lap, unopened. She had a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. "They're not walking away," Audrey said. "Not yet. You don't know that. I know Patterson from their legal team. He texted me 20 minutes ago." Audrey set the portfolio on the table. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "Tell her to keep the ship upright. We're still interested in the cargo." Sabrina stared at the portfolio. "That's either reassuring or deeply condescending." "Probably both," Audrey said. "Patterson's like that." From the corridor outside came the sound of voices, police, hotel staff, one of Darren's team members being walked through a separate interview. Sabrina listened without meaning to, parsing tones, trying to extract information from cadence and volume the way she'd trained herself to do in boardrooms. Darren himself had been separated from the group within the first 20 minutes. One of the detectives, a compact woman named Reyes, who wore her badge on her belt and asked questions without inflection, had pulled him aside and kept him there. Sabrina had watched it happen through the glass partition of the lobby. Darren had kept his composure. He always kept his composure. That was what made him effective, and she was beginning to understand what had made him dangerous. "Where's Travis?" she asked. Audrey hesitated. "Still with Detective Reyes' partner. He's been cooperative. From what I heard, very cooperative." A pause. "He had documentation." "What kind of documentation?" "Reports. Time-stamped. 3 of them. Filed through internal channels over the past month." Audrey's voice was careful. "Warning about security anomalies around your schedule and vehicle routing." Sabrina was quiet for a moment. "I never received them," she said. "No," Audrey said. "You didn't. The way she said it was not an accusation. Audrey was not built for direct confrontation. Her method was to put facts next to each other and let the geometry speak for itself. She did it now. She put the fact of 3 reports on one side and the fact of Sabrina's ignorance on the other, and she let the distance between them sit in the room. Sabrina picked up her phone, put it back down. He submitted them through the security division's intake portal. Yes, which Darren controls. Yes, the words sat there between them, small and flat and very heavy. Travis came out of his interview at noon. He looked the same as he had looked on the sidewalk, which was to say he looked like a man who had done something significant and was not inclined to make much of it. Cut on his left hand had been cleaned and bandaged by a paramedic who had to ask him twice to hold still because Travis kept watching the entrance. He had a paper cup of vending machine coffee that he was drinking without appearing to taste it. Sabrina intercepted him in the corridor before he reached the elevator. He stopped, didn't step back, didn't arrange his face into anything in particular. "Mr. Hollowell," she said. "Ms. Westbrook." His voice was neutral, not cold. Neutral in the way that required more effort than cold. She had rehearsed this in the 40 minutes since the detective had released her. She had arranged words into something that sounded like what she meant. Standing in front of him now, the arrangement came apart. "I should have listened to you this morning," she said. Travis looked at her for a moment. He drank some of the bad coffee. "Yes," he said. "You should have. Not it's okay. Not don't worry about it." Just the plain agreement that she had stated a true thing. She found unexpectedly that she respected him more for it. "The police are going to want to speak with you again," she said. "And I'd like if you're willing for my attorney to review those reports you filed. The time-stamped ones. They're already in the investigator's hands." "I know, I mean copies." She paused. "I want to understand what I didn't see." Something shifted in Travis's expression, not warmth exactly, but a slight reduction in distance. "I'll send them to your office." He turned toward the elevator. "Travis." He stopped again. She didn't know what she wanted to say. That was the honest truth of it. She stopped him without knowing why, some instinct firing before the words were there. He waited. And the waiting had the same quality as everything else about him, patient and complete, without the performance of patience. "I'm sorry," she said, "for this morning." In the lobby. He looked at her for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally. "I know." He got on the elevator and the doors closed, and Sabrina stood in the corridor for a moment before going back to the room where Audrey was waiting, with a restructured afternoon and a list of things that had already gone wrong and were going to need attention. The investigation that followed was not swift or elegant. Real investigations rarely were. Detective Reyes worked methodically, which meant she moved at the speed of evidence rather than the speed of narrative. The 3 individuals apprehended outside the Sterling Crest were professionals. None of them had outstanding warrants in Illinois. All of them carried clean identification that took 2 days to fully verify as fabricated, and none of them said anything during the first round of questioning that was of immediate use. The black SUV was registered to a shell company with a registered agent in Delaware and a mailing address in Nevada, which meant it would take time. Time was not something Sabrina felt she had in abundance. Her attorney, Marcus Hale, was a 61-year-old man who had practiced corporate and criminal law for 30 years, and whose general approach to crisis was to work 18-hour days and drink black coffee and refuse to speculate until he had documents in front of him. He'd been Sabrina's counsel for 4 years, and she'd never seen him rattled. Called him from the hotel, and he arrived within the hour and immediately asked to see everything the tracker from the wheel. Well, the photographs Travis had taken, the 3 internal reports, the log showing when each report had been submitted and whether any had been forwarded or opened by anyone other than the submitter. The answer to the last question was no. None of the reports had been opened by anyone other than Travis himself. They had been submitted. They had not been routed. They existed in the system the way things exist when someone with administrative access has quietly ensured they will not be found. Marcus read the log printout twice without saying anything. Then he asked Audrey to leave the room. "How much do you know about Hollowell's background?" he asked. Sabrina frowned. "He's a driver. He's been with the company. Before that, I don't know. He came through a staffing agency. Darren vetted him." Marcus made a sound. "You might want to think about what it means that Darren vetted the person who ultimately protected you from something Darren was involved in." She hadn't. She sat with it. "Get me his full employment history," Marcus said. "Not from Darren's files. Run it independently." It took 48 hours because of the sealed records. Staffing agency file was thin 8 months of prior driving work, a clean license, a general background check that had been conducted competently but not deeply. What sat underneath it, once Marcus's investigator peeled back the surface, was a gap. 6 years between Travis Hollowell's last documented civilian employment before the driving work and the period before that, which showed a brief stint at a logistics company in Virginia. The gap was filled not with nothing, but with something that required a specific clearance level to access, and Marcus's investigator did not have that clearance. What she did find, through a former JAG officer who owed Marcus a favor, was enough. Travis had enlisted at 22. He had been selected for SEAL training and completed it. He had served on an East Coast team for 2 years before being assessed and accepted into a specialized detachment that focused on high-risk personnel protection and, in certain operational theaters, hostage recovery. He had served in that capacity for 4 years. His service record was sealed in its operational details, but evaluated at the highest tier in the categories of threat assessment, personal protection, and tactical judgment under pressure. He had separated from the Navy quietly 6 years ago and taken the Virginia logistics job for 14 months before moving to Chicago. Marcus put the investigator's summary on Sabrina's desk without a word and let her read it. When she looked up, she said, "He walked away voluntarily. Separated, honorable, no disciplinary record." Marcus paused. His daughter's mother died approximately 2 years ago. Car accident. He's been her sole parent since. Sabrina set the paper down. She thought about the way Travis had placed her behind him on the sidewalk, one arm, certain and immediate, no hesitation. She thought about the 8 seconds on Michigan Avenue that had looked almost casual in how little wasted movement there was. She thought about a man who had spent years doing what he'd done out there, who had come home and chosen to drive a car for a company that barely knew his name, because a little girl needed him to come home every night. "He was protecting me with his personnel reports too," she said slowly. "For weeks. Trying to do it through the right channels." "Yes," Marcus said. "He was." She was quiet for a long time. "And Darren made sure I never heard it." "Yes," Marcus said. "He was doing that too." The name that surfaced in Darren's encrypted communications, extracted by the forensic team from his work devices under the warrant Detective Reyes obtained on the 4th day, was not a name Sabrina immediately recognized. Raymond Lusk. She had to search her memory carefully before she found it. A board member introduced at a governance committee meeting 8 months ago, a man who had spoken 3 times in her presence, always about fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value, always in the practiced tone of someone who had been saying those words for decades. He held a minority stake in Westbrook Capital. He also held, as it turned out, a considerably larger undisclosed interest in the Ardmore financial merger through a series of intermediaries, specifically in one of the Ardmore subsidiaries that would become significantly more valuable under a restructured deal than under the terms Sabrina had currently negotiated. The deal she had negotiated was good for Westbrook's employees and long-term shareholders. The deal Lusk needed was different. It was the kind of deal that required someone else to be sitting in the CEO's chair when it was signed, someone who would accept Lusk's terms in exchange for the appearance of control. It was also the kind of deal that required Sabrina Westbrook to be somewhere unavailable for approximately 72 to 96 hours. Not dead, just gone. Temporarily unreachable, while the board's emergency succession protocol transferred her executive authority. Marcus explained all of this to Sabrina in his office, on the 5th floor of a building 3 blocks from the hotel, using a whiteboard and a series of documents that he had printed and organized into a structure that made the shape of it visible. He was good at that, making invisible things visible, showing you the architecture of something before the demolition. Sabrina listened without interrupting. She had learned to do that in the years when she was building her company, and couldn't afford to miss anything. And she deployed that same focused silence now, sitting across from Marcus with her hands in her lap, following the thread. When he finished, she said, "They were going to hold me somewhere while the board voted. Based on what we have so far, yes. The emergency succession clause in your articles of incorporation allows for a temporary transfer of executive authority if the CEO is incapacitated or unreachable for more than 48 hours and a 2/3 board majority approves it. Lusk had the votes, or believed he did. He needed the window. How many board members? 3 who were aligned with him. 1 who may have been unaware of the full scope. We're still working on that." Sabrina pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. "This has been building for months. At least 6, Marcus said. Possibly from the time the merger was first announced. She thought about Darren, about the 4 years she had trusted him, about the board meetings and the quarterly reviews, and the countless times she had relied on his assessment of risk and threat, never knowing that she was asking the fox to evaluate the henhouse. About how calm he always was, how comprehensive, how reassuring. He had access to everything, she said. My schedule, my route, my communications calendar. He knew which investors were coming, which journalists, what my security posture looked like for any given day. Yes, he designed the vulnerability. We believe so. She stood up, walked to the window, looked at the street below without seeing it. And Travis kept filing reports, she said, into a system Darren controlled. 3 of them Marcus confirmed. The first one dated 41 days ago. 41 days. She had ridden in the back of a car every working morning for 41 days, while the man in the driver's seat was trying to protect her, and the man she trusted was making sure his warnings went nowhere. The geometry of it was almost too stark to look at directly. She said, I need to find Travis Hollowell. It took Audrey a day and a half to locate him. He wasn't hiding. He simply wasn't reachable in the ways that most people in his professional orbit expected. No LinkedIn, no company profile, no social presence beyond what a background check would find. His personal number was in the company files, but he didn't answer calls from numbers he didn't recognize, and Sabrina didn't have his contact information on her personal phone because she had never considered that she might need it. Audrey found the garage through his emergency contact form, which listed a neighbor named Donna who watched Maisie after school, and who, after a brief and somewhat suspicious conversation, confirmed that Travis was working at a place called Kellerman's Auto on Ashland Avenue. Sabrina went alone. Marcus advised against it. Audrey advised against it, more diplomatically but with the same underlying concern. Sabrina went anyway, because she understood, in the particular way you understand things, after they've already embarrassed you, that this was not the kind of conversation that should have a team around it. Kellerman's was a neighborhood garage with 3 bays and an office the size of a large closet. The owner, a man in his 60s with grease on his forearms and reading glasses on top of his head, told her Travis was in the 2nd bay when she gave the name, and then looked at her car and her coat and added, without particular hostility, he's not looking for anything right now, if that's what you're here about. It's not, Sabrina said. Travis was underneath an 8 Civic on a creeper, and he heard her heels on the concrete before she reached the bay. He rolled out from under the car with the unhurried motion of someone who wasn't surprised. He sat up, looked at her, and didn't say anything. He had a socket wrench in one hand and oil on his forearms, and the expression of a man waiting to see what she'd come to say before he decided how to receive it. Sabrina looked around the garage for a moment. At the tool chest against the wall, the motor oil stacked in the corner, the calendar from an auto parts supplier with a month-old date still showing. The small framed photograph on the tool chest, she couldn't make it out from where she stood, but she suspected she knew who it was. Double your salary, she said. Full reinstatement. Official title in the security structure. Travis studied the wrench in his hand. He turned it once, not fidgeting, just occupying his hands, the way men who work with their hands often do when they're thinking. No, he said. Sabrina had expected this. She'd prepared for it. She'd arranged words for this too, and this time she let them come out before the arrangement fell apart, because she had fewer chances now, and she knew it. The company has over 400 employees, she said. Most of them had nothing to do with what Darren and Lusk were building. Some of them have been with me since the beginning, when the beginning was 2 people and a rented desk on the 17th floor of a building on Wacker. If this merger collapses and the board fractures, and no one is coordinating the protection of the company's communications and operations, those people lose their jobs. She paused. I'm not asking you to come back for me. Travis looked at her. The money's not the point, she said. I understand that now. Do you? It wasn't a question. It was the thing you said when you weren't sure someone actually understood, and you were listening for the answer in the thing they said next. Sabrina didn't try to prove it. You submitted 3 reports. Every one of them disappeared, because I gave one person too much administrative power without ever asking whether he was using it correctly. She sat down on an overturned plastic bucket without asking, because standing felt wrong for what she was trying to say. I trusted confidence over character. I saw someone who acted like he had everything under control, and I never looked underneath it. She paused again. I looked right past you for 18 months. Travis was quiet. The garage smelled like motor oil and concrete, and the faint ghost of someone's fast food from earlier in the day. From somewhere in the building came the sound of a radio, something country, turned low. You humiliated me in front of those people, Travis said. Not with heat, just with the flat, plain directness of someone who had decided to say the true thing. I know. I wasn't late because I didn't care about the job. I was late because I was trying to do the job. I know that now. I didn't know it then. She looked at him. I should have asked. I didn't ask. He was quiet again. She let him be quiet. She had learned too late, and in the worst possible way, that this man's silences were not empty. Maisie had a thing this morning, he said, finally. School. 3rd grade presentation. She's been working on it for 2 weeks. He set the wrench down on the edge of the creeper. I was there. I haven't missed one since Carla died. Sabrina said nothing. That doesn't change because someone offers double salary, he said. That doesn't change for anything. It wouldn't have to. He looked at her with a kind of careful attention, measuring the statement. You're saying that now. I know it sounds like I'm saying it because I need something, Sabrina said. I understand why you'd think that. She glanced at the photograph on the tool chest. From here she could make out the shape of a small girl with dark hair and what looked like a gap-toothed smile. But I'm asking you to come back, not because you're the best option I have. I'm asking you because I think the people who are going to keep coming after the company are going to be smarter and more careful than the ones who came after me on that sidewalk. And I think you'll see them before anyone else does. Travis looked at the photograph too, then back at her. I'm not going to be your security chief, he said. I'm not offering you that title. Darren's role is being restructured regardless. Then what are you offering? A position that doesn't exist yet, she said. Because I built the wrong position when I built Darren's role, and I need to build the right one. Which means starting from what matters and designing around it, instead of the other way. Travis stood up from the creeper. He was taller than she'd registered in the car, in the lobby. Even on the sidewalk, she'd processed him in the way you process people who occupy the role of service provider, which was to say she'd processed the function and not the person. Standing across from her in the garage bay, there was no role to filter him through. He was just a man, tired in the particular way that single parents of small children carry their tiredness, with a bandage cut on his left hand and motor oil on his forearms and a decision being worked out behind his eyes. My daughter comes home at 4, he said. I heard. Whoever watches her after school has to be home by 4:15, which means I need to be available by 4. That's workable. It's not negotiable. I understand the difference, she said. 4 o'clock is 4 o'clock. He looked at her for a long moment. Why are you doing this yourself? You have a lawyer. You have an assistant. You have a whole structural apparatus for this kind of negotiation. It was a fair question. She had asked herself the same one in the car on the way over. Because I fired you badly, she said. And I think making it right requires doing it in the same format. She met his eyes. You were standing in a room full of people when I did it. This isn't a room full of people, but it's still me, and it's still direct, and I think that's what it requires. Pick the wrench back up. Not to use it to have something to do with his hands while he thought. Outside the bay, a car pulled into the lot and the owner's voice carried briefly and then faded. I'll think about it, Travis said. Sabrina stood, brushed off her coat out of habit. How long do you need? Overnight. Okay. She turned toward the garage entrance. She had taken 3 steps when he spoke again. The people who came after you on that sidewalk, he said. They were organized. They communicated in advance with someone inside. They were positioned before your car pulled up. She stopped. Whoever designed that operation was working from a complete picture of your security structure, Travis said. They knew how many people you had, where they'd be positioned, and what it would take to open a gap. That level of detail doesn't come from Darren alone. It required access to your communications and your operating schedule at the operational level. He paused, which means there may be more than one person still inside the company who helped them build it. Sabrina stood in the entrance of the garage bay with October light behind her and let the weight of that settle. Why you're still watching, she said. I never stopped, he said simply. She nodded once. She didn't say thank you, because it didn't fit the shape of what was happening between them, and she was beginning to understand the shape of it better than she had 12 hours ago. She walked back to her car. She sat in it without starting it for almost a minute. The merger, the board, the employees who had given her years of their lives building something they believed in. Darren, who had smiled at her every morning for 4 years. Lusk, who had spoken about fiduciary responsibility in that careful bored voice. The 3 attackers on the sidewalk who had been positioned and coordinated and almost perfectly timed. And Travis Hollowell, who had found a tracking device at 5 in the morning and tried to tell her 3 times before she fired him, and still stayed long enough to make sure she was safe, and who was now in a garage on Ashland Avenue, deciding whether to help her again. Started the car. She didn't deserve it, she knew that. But deserving wasn't the only currency in circulation, and the man in that garage was, she was beginning to understand, operating on a completely different set of values than the ones she'd built her professional life around. He wasn't measuring this in terms of what she owed him or what he stood to gain. He was measuring it, she thought, the way he measured most things, by whether the people who couldn't protect themselves would be okay if he walked away. She drove back toward the city, and the radio played something she wasn't listening to. And somewhere behind her on Ashland Avenue, Travis Hollowell stood in the second bay of a neighborhood garage and looked at a photograph of his daughter and made the calculation that only he could make. In the morning, he called Audrey's number because Sabrina had left Audrey's card, understanding correctly that a man like Travis would call that felt like a door rather than the number that felt like a request and said 4 words. Tell her I'm in. Audrey relayed the message. Sabrina was in a meeting with Marcus and 2 forensic accountants when the text came through. She read it once, set her phone face down on the table. Where were we? She said. But her expression, for just a moment before she reassembled it, was the kind that Marcus had seen maybe 3 times in 4 years of working with her. Not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated than that. Something that looked like the beginning of understanding what she had almost thrown away. Travis came back on a Wednesday. He didn't make an announcement about it. He didn't come to the main office. He called Audrey at 7 in the morning and told her he'd need a workspace with no shared network access, a direct line to Marcus Hale, and a full copy of the company's security architecture documentation from the past 18 months, not the current version. Because the current version had been curated by Darren, but the original implementation specs from when the system was first built. Audrey had all 3 ready by 9. She had been expecting the call since the previous afternoon, which was the kind of practical foresight that made her indispensable and which she never drew attention to. He set up in a small conference room on the 14th floor, away from the executive suite, away from the security division's offices on the 8th floor, away from the people who would recognize him and have questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. The room had a window that faced east and a table that was too large for one person, and Travis spread the documentation across half of it and worked through the morning, with the methodical attention of someone who has been trained to find the thing that doesn't belong. Sabrina came by at 11. She knocked, which was not her habit. Her habit was to open doors, because she owned the company and the doors were hers to open. Travis noticed the knock. I'm not interrupting? She asked. You're the one who brought me back, he said, without looking up from the documentation. You can interrupt. She came in and looked at the spread of papers and schematics on the table. What are you seeing? Gaps, he said. He pointed to a section of the routing architecture. Your vehicle tracking system, the legitimate one, the one that's supposed to monitor the company fleet, it logs departure and arrival times, but not route data. Which means anyone with access to the log could tell where a car started and where it ended, but not how it got there. He moved his hand to another section. Except the log has a secondary field. It's called a routing reference. Supposed to be empty, it's a legacy field from an older system that was never fully deprecated. Darren's team has been populating it. He looked up at her. With route data. Sabrina looked at the field. He was logging the routes in a field no one was looking at. And the field syncs to an external API endpoint. One that's not in the current documentation. Travis tapped the paper. It was added 14 months ago, which is 8 months before anyone approached Lusk about the merger. The timing of it settled over the room like a change in air pressure. He was building the infrastructure before the plan existed, Sabrina said slowly. Or the plan existed before you knew about the merger, Travis said. Someone may have known what was coming before you did. She sat down across from him. She looked at the documentation with the expression she got when she was processing something that required rearranging everything. She thought she understood not panic, but a particular kind of focused stillness that Travis had started to recognize as the thing underneath the polished exterior. The thing that had actually built the company. How long to map the full scope of it, she asked. Give me 3 days, he said. And I need someone I choose to help me, not from your security team. Who? A woman named Petra Sorrell. She does network forensics. I've worked with her before. He said it without elaborating on the context of that previous work, and Sabrina didn't ask, because she was beginning to understand which questions Travis would answer and which ones he'd simply wait out. "Get her in," Sabrina said. "Whatever she charges, pay it." Travis nodded and looked back down at the documentation. Sabrina started to stand. Then, because she was still learning when to push and when not to, she said, "How's Maisie?" Travis's pen stopped moving for just a moment. "She's okay. She's staying with Donna until 4. Did she know about what happened at the hotel?" "I told her I had a complicated day at work." He picked up the pen again. "She's 8. She knows complicated usually means I came home tired. She made me a card." Sabrina thought about a small girl with dark hair making a get-well card for a father who had spent the morning taking apart a kidnapping operation with his bare hands, and the image of it did something strange to her chest. "That's good," she said. "That she made a card?" "Yeah," Travis said. "It is." She left him to the documentation. Petra Sorrell arrived the next morning with a laptop bag, a portable drive array, and the expression of someone who charged enough that she didn't have to apologize for taking up space. She was in her mid-40s, compact and precise, with close-cropped hair and a habit of asking questions that sounded like statements. She and Travis worked without much conversation, which Audrey, who brought them coffee twice and lunch once, found either impressive or unnerving depending on the hour. By the end of the second day, they had the shape of it. Darren had been exfiltrating data from Westbrook's internal communication system for 14 months through a combination of the routing field exploit and a secondary method, a hardware device planted on the server room's main switch that created a parallel data stream routing copies of specific email threads to an encrypted external archive. The device was small, matte black, and designed to look like standard infrastructure hardware. It had been there long enough that anyone conducting a casual inspection would have assumed it belonged. Travis removed it himself, because Petra identified it remotely and described its location down to the rack position, and Travis was the one Sabrina trusted to go into the server room without an audience. The emails in the external archive, once Petra accessed them through a brute force decryption that took 11 hours, were comprehensive. There were communications between Darren and Raymond Lusk, stretching back 13 months, detailed and operational, laying out the timeline, succession strategy, the board votes Lusk believed he controlled, and the contingency plans for different scenarios. There were communications with the contractors who had been positioned outside the Sterling Crest. There were wire transfers and offshore account references that made Marcus Hale's expression, when Travis walked him through it, shift from concentrated to something that took Sabrina a moment to identify as genuine anger. "This is enough," Marcus said. "This is more than enough." For prosecution, Travis said. "But Lusk still has board relationships. And Darren, wherever he is right now, he's been released on bail, pending arraignment," Marcus said. "Has had a week to consider his options and talk to lawyers who will tell him his best deal comes from cooperation. Which means we don't know yet what he's telling people, or who he's warning." The three of them were sitting in Marcus's office, the whiteboard behind him now covered in a different architecture than the one he'd drawn the week before, the same facts rearranged into the shape of what was coming rather than what had already happened. Sabrina said, "What's the board meeting schedule?" Marcus checked his calendar. "There's a dinner scheduled for Friday." The quarterly alignment meeting was on the calendar before any of this started. Lusk will almost certainly attend. Legally, he's still a minority shareholder with board observer status. We can't exclude him without triggering additional legal exposure. "He'll want to see how things stand," Sabrina said. "After everything that's happened, he needs to know whether the board is still viable for him, whether there's still a path." Travis was looking at the whiteboard. He'd been quiet for the last several minutes, and his silence had the quality that Sabrina had come to recognize as productive, not disengagement, but the particular focus of someone assembling something in their head. "Then we used the dinner," he said. "Planning took 4 days. Travis laid it out in the 14th floor conference room with Petra, Marcus, Audrey, and Sabrina, using a simple diagram that showed the Sterling Crest's event floor, the elevator banks, the underground garage, and the surrounding street grid. He was methodical about it, building from the ground up, not starting with the desired outcome and working backward, but starting with what they knew and building forward. The dinner would proceed as scheduled. Sabrina would attend. Her security detail genuinely vetted, sourced through a firm Travis had used during his operational years, and still trusted would be positioned at points he designated. Audrey would remain close to Sabrina's side and carry a secondary communication device. The manipulation of information was the central mechanism. Darren, still facing charges and desperate for leverage, was almost certainly in communication with Lusk. Travis's working assumption, supported by a pattern in the archived emails that Petra had flagged, was that Darren had an emergency protocol with Lusk for exactly this kind of scenario, secure channel for communicating when primary methods were compromised. They couldn't access that channel, but they could feed into it. Audrey would be the conduit. She would relay carefully selected information to Darren's former assistant, a young man named Cole, who had been cooperative with investigators, and who, more importantly, was scared enough to follow instructions precisely. And Cole would pass it to Darren, through channels they would expect to be private. The information would indicate that Sabrina's security posture for the dinner was conventional. Standard two-person detail, no additional measures. A public arrival at the main entrance. None of it would be true. Darren would relay it to Lusk. Lusk would see an opportunity he couldn't afford to miss. The dinner was his last viable window before the legal proceedings locked everything down. He'll move on her at the dinner, Travis said. But he can't use contractors again. That window is closed. He'll try something that looks legitimate. Something that uses the board dinner's structure as cover. The garage, Marcus said. If he wants to make her sign something, he needs privacy. The underground garage is the most isolated space in that building, which is why we're going to make sure she goes there, Travis said. Sabrina looked at him across the table. You want me to be the bait. I want Lusk to think you're cornered, Travis said. I want him to believe he's already won, because a man who believes he's already won stops being careful. He paused. He'll expose himself completely, say everything, because in that moment he thinks it doesn't matter what he says. The room was quiet. And you'll be there, Sabrina said. I'll be there before either of you are, Travis said. The garage sweep starts 4 hours ahead. Petra monitors cameras remotely. My team controls every entry point. He looked at her steadily. You walk in, you let him talk, you walk out. That's the whole job. Sabrina said, what if it goes sideways? Things go sideways, Travis said. What plans account for? She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. The look between them had a quality that was harder to name than most things in that room. Not reassurance exactly, because Travis was not built for reassurance and not a promise, because both of them had lived enough life to be skeptical of promises. It was something more like the understanding that they were each do their part of this without flinching, and that neither of them was going to waste the other's time pretending it was going to be clean. All right, she said, let's build it. The Friday dinner at the Sterling Crest was the kind of event that Sabrina had organized and attended dozens of times. The Meridian Ballroom on the 31st floor. Round tables with white linen and Chicago laid out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. The particular low murmur of people in expensive clothing saying things that mattered to them and occasionally mattered to the world. The company's board members and senior shareholders arrived between 6:30 and 7. Waitstaff moved through the room with the practiced efficiency of people who had served rooms like this for years. Sabrina arrived at 6:48. She wore a dark charcoal dress she'd worn to 2 previous dinners. Because she'd made a deliberate decision about her appearance, she should look like herself. Like the person who had been doing this for years, not like someone who had spent the past week reconstructing the internal architecture of a conspiracy against her. She shook hands and spoke with people and smiled at the right moments, and the only indication that anything was different was that she'd eaten almost nothing since lunch, and her left hand, the one holding the glass of sparkling water she wasn't drinking, was not entirely steady. Audrey was beside her. Audrey was always beside her, and tonight she was also wearing a small wireless earpiece that Travis had given her that morning, calibrated to the frequency his team was using. Raymond Lusk arrived at 7:15. He was 63, distinguished in the way that men who have spent decades in rooms like this become distinguished: the bearing, the grooming, the practiced ease of someone who has never had to wait for much. He wore a charcoal suit and a pocket square and moved through the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the room still belonged to him. He greeted 2 board members warmly. He spoke briefly with Westbrook's CFO, and then he found Sabrina, and his expression arranged itself into something that looked like collegial warmth, and he extended his hand. Sabrina shook it. Sabrina, he said, you look well, given the week. Thank you, Raymond. Her voice was even. It's been productive. He made a sound that could have been sympathy. Terrible business with Voss. I've known him for years. I recommended him, as you know. I feel some responsibility. These things happen, Sabrina said. He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his, and beneath the professional surfaces of both of them, something moved the awareness of what each knew and what each was pretending not to know. Then a board member appeared at Lusk's shoulder and drew him away, and Sabrina turned back toward the room and exhaled once, slowly, through her nose. Audrey leaned slightly toward her. Travis says the garage is clear. His team is in position. How many of Lusk's people? Audrey listened to the earpiece. 2 confirmed in the building. 1 in the lobby. 1 in the parking structure, northeast corner. They already have someone down there, Sabrina said. Yes. Travis knew they would. He cleared them both into his sightlines when they arrived, Audrey said quietly. He says to proceed. The dinner proceeded. Sabrina sat at the head table and ate enough that no one would comment on it, and listened to a presentation from her CFO about quarterly performance and answered questions from 2 board members about the merger timeline with answers that were accurate, measured, and entirely designed to communicate that the company was stable, the leadership was intact, and the coming weeks looked like business as usual. At 9:17, her personal phone lit up with a message from a number that wasn't in her contacts. The message read, "Come to the underground garage, alone. Level B2. You have 10 minutes. Come without Lennox, without security, without your attorney. Or I make a call that ends your merger before midnight." She read it once, set the phone face down on the table, picked up her water glass and put it down without drinking. Across the room, Raymond Lusk was speaking to a board member named Clara Vance and not looking at Sabrina, which was itself the look of a man who had not just sent a threatening text message, studied normalcy of someone buying himself an alibi within the social architecture of the room. Sabrina stood. She said something to the board member beside her about the restroom. She walked toward the ballroom exit with the natural pace of a woman who had somewhere to be. At the elevator bank, she pressed B2. The elevator descended in the particular silence of elevator cabins in large buildings. The faint mechanical sound, the slight pressure change, the small lurch at the bottom. When the doors opened, the garage opened around her. Concrete and fluorescence, the smell of exhaust and cold air from the ventilation system, the rows of parked vehicles receding into shadow. She walked toward the center of the space. Her heels were loud on the concrete. She had thought about changing into flats before leaving the office this morning and had decided against it. Changing shoes was a tell, and she needed nothing about her appearance to suggest she was preparing for anything other than a dinner. Ms. Westbrook. The voice came from her left, near a concrete pillar. Raymond Lusk emerged from behind it with the 2 men she recognized from Audrey's description. One of them the same person who had been in the lobby, the other a man she hadn't seen before, broader, with the specific stillness of someone paid for his physical presence rather than his conversational abilities. Behind Lusk was Darren Voss. Sabrina stopped. She had known he might be here. Travis had flagged it as a possibility, 50-50, depending on how desperate Darren's situation had become, but seeing him was different from knowing he might be there. 4 years, his composure was still intact, mostly. There were lines in it now that hadn't been there last week, places where the surface showed the pressure underneath, but he was holding himself with the professional bearing he'd spent decades cultivating, and she felt, involuntarily, a flash of something that wasn't quite grief, but was in the same neighborhood. "Darren," she said. "Ms. Westbrook," he said, "I'm sorry it came to this." "I am, actually." And the strange thing was that she believed him, not that it changed anything, not that it mitigated a single element of what he'd done, but that the regret was real in some complicated way that she didn't have the vocabulary for in this moment. It was always a business problem. It was never personal. "You arranged to have me abducted," she said. "Force a board vote while I was unavailable. The people I hired were supposed to hold you somewhere comfortable for 72 hours, Darren said. "Nothing violent. You were never supposed to be hurt. The man who grabbed for me on the sidewalk was not gentle." Darren's jaw tightened. "There were some personnel decisions I should have supervised more directly." Lusk stepped forward. He had a leather document folder under his arm, and he removed it and opened it on the hood of the nearest car, the papers inside visible from where Sabrina stood. "We can make this considerably simpler than it needs to be," he said. "You sign the transfer of executive authority to the interim structure we've established. The board ratifies it in an emergency session tomorrow morning. The merger proceeds under revised terms." He looked at her. "You retain a consultant role with compensation, and if I don't sign, Then the board receives a set of documents that will suggest you had prior knowledge of the security vulnerabilities Voss exploited and chose not to report them. It won't be true, but it will be convincing, and it will take long enough to disprove that the merger will be dead before you clear your name. Sabrina looked at the documents on the car hood. She looked at Darren, who was looking at the floor. She looked at Lusk, who was watching her with the patient assurances of a man who believed he had constructed a room with no exit. She said, "You've been very thorough." "I've been doing this for a long time," Lusk said. "I know," she said. "Longer than I realized." She heard it before Lusk did the footsteps. Not hurried. Measured. The particular cadence of someone who is not worried about announcing their presence, because their presence was already exactly where they intended to be. Travis emerged from behind the concrete pillar at the far end of the garage, 12 meters away, moving at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, the pace of someone walking toward a destination they've already mapped completely. Lusk turned. His expression went through several changes quickly. "Who? Travis Hollowell," Travis said. He stopped 6 meters out. He was wearing a dark jacket and no tie, and he looked, in this light, exactly like what he was, a man who had spent years in rooms like this one, and in rooms considerably worse. "You might remember me. I used to drive for the company." "He's the driver," Darren said. His voice had changed. Something had shifted in it, not fear exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man who has seen what Travis was capable of and is now recalculating the room. "I was," Travis said. He looked at Lusk. "You should know that this conversation has been recorded since Ms. Westbrook stepped off the elevator. The detail about holding her somewhere comfortable for 72 hours is going to be particularly useful to the prosecutors." He paused. Mr. Voss's elaboration about personnel supervision will probably come up at sentencing. Lusk looked at Sabrina. His face had gone through the kind of change that happens when a man understands that the room he believed he'd built has a different shape than the one he was standing in. "The documents are fabricated," Sabrina said. "You said so yourself just now, on a recording. And the network forensics team has had Darren's communication archive for 6 days." She looked at him steadily. "There's no deal to make, Raymond. There's just what comes next." 2 men with Lusk moved. The one nearest Travis reached him first, or tried to. What actually happened was that he reached for Travis, and Travis was no longer where the reach expected him to be. And then the man was against the nearest vehicle, with his arm in a configuration that made further movement inadvisable. The second man read what had happened and adjusted, which was the correct tactical response and still not sufficient, because Travis's assessment of the angle and timing was 3 steps ahead, and the second man found himself with the same problem as the first in approximately 4 seconds. Neither man was seriously hurt. Travis was careful about that, controlled, precise, enough to stop the threat and not an increment more. It was the same efficiency that had been on the sidewalk outside the Sterling Crest a week ago, the same absolute economy of motion that came from somewhere much deeper than training, from the place where training becomes instinct and instinct becomes the way a man simply moves through the world. Darren didn't move at all. He stood beside the car with the documents and watched it happen and made no attempt to run, which Sabrina found later, when she had time to think about it, to be the saddest detail of the entire evening. Lusk took 3 steps toward the far exit. He walked with the quick, stiff gait of a man who has decided that escape is still theoretically possible and is pursuing the theory rather than the reality. He reached the exit door, pushed it, and found it locked. Pushed it again. Then he heard the vehicles outside. Detective Reyes had positioned 2 cars at the B2 level exit 40 minutes before the dinner began. 2 more at the elevator lobby. She had been, in Travis's assessment, the most straightforward person involved in this entire situation. She had wanted documentation. She had received it, and she had moved. The door opened from the outside. Reyes came through first with 2 detectives behind her. She looked at Lusk. Then at the scene around her, the 2 men sitting against the vehicle, Travis standing near the center of the space, Sabrina to his left, Darren still standing beside the car with the documents, with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of road. Reyes looked at Travis. "All of you in one place," she said. "That's convenient." "Seemed efficient," Travis said. She produced her badge for Lusk, which was a formality since he could see her detectives, and the situation required no further identification. "Mr. Lusk," she said, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy, corporate fraud, and accessory to criminal confinement." She looked at Darren. "Mr. Voss, I think you already know the terms of your situation. Your attorney has been notified that you're here." Darren said nothing. He looked at Sabrina one last time, and the look was complicated in the way that 4 years of professional proximity made looks complicated, and then he looked at the floor again. Sabrina watched them put Darren in cuffs. She watched a detective collect the documents from the car hood as evidence. She watched Lusk, who had recovered his composure with the resilience of a man who had been paying lawyers for 30 years, and understood that the next chapter of this would be fought in a different kind of room. Say something quiet to one of the detectives that she couldn't hear. The garage was loud with voices and radio communication and the sound of vehicles outside, and then gradually it was quieter, and then the immediate population of the space had reduced to Sabrina, Travis, Reyes, and one detective making notes on a tablet. Reyes asked Sabrina a handful of questions, which Sabrina answered, and then said she'd need a formal statement in the morning, which Sabrina agreed to, and then Reyes looked at Travis with the expression she'd had in every interaction with him assessment, something approaching respect, and a particular wariness that Sabrina suspected Reyes applied to anyone who moved the way Travis moved. "You didn't call me before you set this up," Reyes said. "I called you 4 days ago and walked you through the full architecture," Travis said. "I mean tonight specifically. The timing. I told you the dinner." Reyes looked at him. "You said probably the dinner." "Detective," Travis said, not quite smiling. "You had cars in position." Reyes made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Don't do this again without a clearer timeline," she said, and walked toward the elevator. The detective followed her. And then the underground garage of the Sterling Crest Hotel was quiet, the way spaces go quiet after something loud and consequential has finished happening in them. The fluorescent lights buzzed. One of the light fixtures at the far end flickered intermittently. The ventilation system breathed its cold air through the space. Sabrina stood in the middle of it. She had been standing in the same approximate spot since Reyes arrived, and she became aware of this, now that she hadn't moved, that her heels were on concrete, that she was holding her phone in her right hand without knowing when she'd taken it out. She looked at it, no new messages. The ballroom above her was, presumably, still going dessert service, bored small talk, the performance of normalcy proceeding without its central figure. She looked at Travis. He was still, watching the exit Reyes had used, then the elevator bank, then the far corner where the 2 men had been. Assessing, making sure. "Travis," she said. He looked at her. She didn't have a sentence ready. This was becoming a pattern with him. She opened her mouth, and the prepared version of whatever she meant to say dissolved, and what was left was something more honest and considerably less composed. "You came in from the pillar on the far side," she said, 40 meters from where I was standing. 42, he said. "You were already in the garage when I came down." "I was here at 5 o'clock this afternoon," he said. "Walked the whole level. Identified the positions." He paused. The far pillar had the best sight line to the elevator exit and to the secondary exit Lusk tried. From there, I could move to either in the same time. She thought about him walking this concrete space alone at 5 in the afternoon, 4 hours before the dinner started, mapping exit angles and sight lines, running the geometry of a situation that hadn't happened yet. "Were you scared?" she asked. Then immediately felt the question was wrong, too personal, too presumptuous. But Travis didn't deflect it. He considered it the way he considered most things, directly and without performance. "I don't get scared the way most people mean it," he said. "I get focused, which is its own kind of feeling." He paused. "Maisie knows I was doing something tonight that mattered. I didn't tell her what. She made me promise to text her when it was done." He took out his phone, typed something brief, put it back in his pocket. Sabrina watched him do it. The CEO of a company that managed $400 million in assets, standing in a parking garage, in a charcoal dress at 9:45 at night, watching a former Navy SEAL text his 8-year-old daughter that he was okay. There was something about the ordinary smallness of the gesture, set against everything that had just happened in this space, that moved through her in a way she didn't try to name. "Thank you," she said. Travis looked at her. Not the deflecting look, not the professional acknowledgement. Just a direct look that held the weight of what she meant and didn't require supplementing. "I know," he said. He walked with her to the elevator. He pressed the button and stood beside her in the way he'd stood in that garage for the past 4 hours, and in the way he'd stood on Michigan Avenue the week before present, and watchful and certain in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance, and everything to do with having decided, somewhere along the way, to stand between the things he valued and the things that threatened them. The elevator came. They rode up in silence, 31 floors to the ballroom level, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that accumulates between people who have been through something together and have arrived, without discussing it, at the understanding that they don't need to fill every space with words. The doors opened onto the hallway outside the Meridian Ballroom. Music filtered through the closed ballroom doors. The low conversation of 30 people who didn't yet know that the man who had been trying to take their livelihoods had just been arrested in the garage below them. Audrey was in the hallway. She looked at Sabrina, then at Travis, then at the general state of both of them, the particulate evidence of the garage in Travis's jacket, the controlled calm of Sabrina's expression, the absence of anyone else. "Done?" Audrey asked. "Done," Sabrina said. Audrey pressed her lips together and nodded once, and there was something in her face that was relief, but more than relief, the deep exhale of someone who has been holding something carefully for a week and has just been told she can put it down. "Clara Vance is asking about you," Audrey said. "Two other board members. They can see something has shifted." "Tell them I'll be in shortly," Sabrina said. "Give me 5 minutes." Audrey went back through the ballroom door. Sabrina stood in the hallway with Travis. The music from inside was something orchestral, low, and conversational beneath the voices. "You should go back in," Travis said. "I know." She looked at the ballroom door. "I don't love walking into that room right now." "You built the room," Travis said, "and most of the people in it." He said it simply, not as encouragement, more as a statement of fact that he thought she might have temporarily lost track of. She recovered it now. "Go home," she said. "Maisie again." "Tell her," she paused. "Tell her the complicated day is finished." Something moved in Travis's face. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lived in the same neighborhood. "I will," he said. He walked toward the elevator. She watched him go. Then she turned, pulled the ballroom door open, and walked back into the room she had built, the room full of people who didn't yet know how close they'd come to losing everything, and who would learn it, because she was going to tell them, and she was going to do it without softening the parts that reflected badly on herself. That was the next thing. She was getting better at knowing what the next thing was. The board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning at 9. Saturday passed in the particular suspended quiet of a city that doesn't know it's waiting for something. Sabrina spent most of it in her home office, which was a converted second bedroom in her Lincoln Park apartment, with bookshelves she never dusted and a desk that faced a window overlooking a street she rarely looked at. She worked through the weekend files Marcus had sent, the legal filings, the investigators' summary updates, the preliminary forensic accounting report that mapped the full financial architecture of what Lusk had been building for 13 months. She read it all, took notes in her specific cramped handwriting that nobody else could decipher, and drank too much coffee and ate a granola bar at 2 in the afternoon that she immediately regretted. Marcus called at 4. "Clara Vance reached out to me this morning," he said. Clara was one of the board members Sabrina had spoken with briefly after returning to the ballroom Friday night. She was 61, a retired investment banker who had served on 3 other boards and whose general disposition toward corporate governance was serious to the point of sometimes being exhausting, which was exactly the disposition Sabrina needed from her right now. "She's asking about the Monday meeting." "What specifically?" "Whether you're planning to address the board directly or through counsel." Sabrina looked out the window she never looked at. A woman was walking a small dog on the street below. The dog was investigating a crack in the sidewalk with tremendous focus. "Directly," Sabrina said. A pause on Marcus's end. "That's what I told her you'd say." "Is she going to be a problem?" "Clara?" Another pause. "No, Clara's a straight-line thinker. She wants to understand what happened and what the plan is. She's not interested in politics right now." He paused again. "The ones you should think about are Pemberton and Greaves." Gerald Pemberton and Diane Greaves, 2 of the 4 board members Lusk had believed he controlled. The forensic communications had established that both had received information from Lusk about the merger restructuring, but what was still unclear legally was whether they had understood the full scope of what Lusk was doing or had simply believed they were supporting an aggressive but legal board action. It was a meaningful distinction. It was also the kind of distinction that attorneys argued about for months. "Do they know we have the communications?" Sabrina asked. "Pemberton's attorney called me yesterday," Marcus said. "So yes." "How's Pemberton scared?" Marcus said, which is appropriate. A pause. "Greaves hasn't called yet, which means either she has a better attorney or she's making a different calculation." Sabrina turned her chair away from the window. "What about the shareholder meeting?" The emergency session, is that confirmed? Monday afternoon, following the board meeting. The shareholder notice went out Friday before close of business. He paused. You're going to face pressure to step aside voluntarily. Some of it will be framed as being in the company's best interest. Some of it will be more aggressive. I know. I want you to think carefully about how you open, Marcus said. Not what you say. You'll know what to say, but the room's temperature before you say it. People in that room on Monday have spent a week in a story that was written by other people. You need to give them a different story before they vote on the ending. After she hung up, Sabrina sat at her desk for a long time without picking up anything. She thought about what Marcus had said. She thought about the way she had walked back into the Meridian ballroom on Friday night and asked for everyone's attention and told them, in plain terms, that Raymond Lusk had been arrested in the garage below them, that Darren Voss had been taken into custody, and that the company was stable. She had watched their faces while she spoke the shock, the recalibration, the particular expression of people who are trying to process a large amount of new information while also performing composure in a room full of colleagues. Clara Vance had asked 2 specific questions and listened to the answers without interrupting. Pemberton had not said anything at all. Greaves had left within 10 minutes of the announcement, which was noted by everyone and commented on by no one in the moment. She had not told them everything. There was more that needed to be said, and it needed to be said in a different room, in a different format, in front of people who had the authority to act on it. Monday morning, 9 o'clock. She thought about the things she was going to have to say out loud that she had never said out loud before, and she thought about whether she was equal to saying them. She decided she would have to be, so she would be. Sunday afternoon, Travis came by the office. Not her home, the office. He called ahead, which she'd started to understand was his general approach to her spaces. He didn't assume access, even when she'd given it to him. He asked if the 14th floor conference room was available, and she said she'd arrange it, and he arrived at 2 with a document box and Petra Sorel, who had apparently not left the project despite the garage operation being concluded, which said something about either her professional thoroughness or Travis's persuasiveness, or possibly both. They spent 2 hours going through the final security audit, not the conspiracy architecture, which was now fully in the investigators' hands, but the underlying vulnerabilities in Westbrook's systems that had allowed it to happen. The legitimate ones, the operational gaps that had nothing to do with Darren's intentional sabotage, and everything to do with the way the company's security infrastructure had been built too quickly by one person, without adequate oversight. Travis didn't editorialize. He presented the gaps and the remedies in the same methodical way. He'd presented everything since coming back factual, specific, without the flourish of someone performing expertise. Petra filled in the technical details. Sabrina took notes and asked questions, and some of the questions were good ones, which Travis acknowledged, and some were based on a misunderstanding of how the systems worked, which he corrected without making her feel stupid about it, which she appreciated more than she said. At the end, Petra packed her drive array and said she'd have the full written report by Tuesday and left. Travis started putting documents back in the box. "Can I ask you something?" Sabrina said. "Yeah. The board meeting is tomorrow. There's going to be a faction that argues I should step aside." She said it the same way she'd say anything factual. Their argument isn't entirely without merit. I created the conditions that allowed this to happen. I gave too much administrative authority to one person without accountability structures. I dismissed your warnings without hearing them. Travis looked at her across the table. "If you were a shareholder," she said, "would you keep me?" He was quiet for a moment. "That's not my decision." "I know. I'm asking what you think." He set down the folder he was holding. He looked at the table for a moment, and she could see him working through whether to say the real thing or the diplomatic version. "I think you made bad calls," he said. "You trusted someone who'd been positioned to earn your trust, and you didn't build in the checks that would have caught him. Those are real failures." He paused. "But the thing that happened after those failures, the way you handled it, that's harder to fake." "What do you mean?" "You came to a garage on Ashland Avenue yourself," he said. "You didn't send lawyers or a title. You came and you said what you'd done wrong, and you meant it. That's not a strategy. I know what a strategy looks like, and that wasn't it." He paused again. "And the way you walked back into that ballroom Friday night. You could have let the lawyers handle the announcement. You didn't." Sabrina looked at the table. "I'm not saying you don't have work to do," Travis said. "You have a lot of work to do. But a person who genuinely isn't capable of leading doesn't do what you've done in the past 10 days. He picked the folder back up. What I'd say if I were a shareholder. She nodded. She didn't thank him. Because it didn't fit, it would have made it smaller than it was. Just let it sit there in the room and held it. What about the position? She asked. The one I offered. We haven't formalized anything. I know, he said. Does that mean you're still thinking? He put the last document in the box. I'm still here, he said. That means something. She thought it meant quite a lot. The emergency shareholder meeting was held in the main conference room on the 22nd floor, which was the largest meeting space in the building, and which seated 40 people comfortably and 50 uncomfortably. On Monday, it had 63, which meant that the chairs along the perimeter walls were filled, and 3 people were standing near the back. The board meeting had run from 9 until 11:40, long and sometimes heated, and had produced no formal vote on her leadership. The quorum conditions for a removal motion hadn't been satisfied, partly because 2 board members who had been aligned with Lusk had declined to attend pending legal advice, and partly because Clara Vance had moved efficiently to table any leadership discussions until the shareholder meeting, which was the correct procedural move and which she made without apparent maneuvering, simply because it was correct. Now Sabrina stood at the front of the conference room and looked at 63 people who were all, in different ways, frightened and waiting. She had prepared remarks. She had spent Saturday evening writing them out longhand, which was not her usual method, but which seemed necessary for this, and then she had read them twice Sunday morning and put them in her desk drawer and not taken them out again. She knew what she needed to say. Writing it down had been about making sure she could say it, about practicing the shape of the sentences in her head until they were familiar enough that her voice wouldn't do something unreliable when she said them out loud. Now, started without preamble. I want to begin by telling you what I did wrong, she said. The room shifted. She had expected the small collective adjustment of people who anticipated a defense and got something else. 4 years ago, I hired Darren Voss as head of security based on board recommendations and a strong professional record. I gave him significant administrative authority over the company's security architecture, including control over internal reporting systems. I did not build adequate accountability structures around that authority. I assumed his competence also meant his integrity, and I didn't create mechanisms that would have revealed a difference between those 2 things. She paused. That was a failure of governance. It's mine. Gerald Pemberton, seated at the far left of the main table, was looking at the surface in front of him. Greaves hadn't come. Her attorney had sent a written statement, which was on the table unopened. 3 weeks before the incident at the Sterling Crest Hotel, Sabrina continued, an employee named Travis Hollowell, who was then working as my driver, submitted the first of 3 internal security reports, warning of anomalies in the company's security system. All 3 reports were routed through the intake portal that Darren controlled. None of them reached me. She let that sit for a moment. The morning those reports were meant to have prevented became the morning I fired Mr. Hollowell publicly in front of the board and press for being 3 minutes late. He was late because he had been in the garage at 5 in the morning, removing a tracking device from my vehicle. Someone near the back made a sound. It wasn't a word, just an involuntary exhale. I want to be precise about what I did, because imprecision makes it easier to excuse, Sabrina said. I didn't make a rush judgment. I made a judgment. I chose to listen to Darren's framing of the situation, because Darren was confident, and because I was under pressure, and because Travis Hollowell was quiet and didn't push back, and because somewhere in my thinking, without ever articulating it to myself, I placed more weight on Darren's presentation than on Travis's 15 months of reliable work. She paused. I fired the man who was trying to save me. The room was very still. She had thought this would be harder to say out loud. It was hard, but it was a clean kind of hard, the hard of doing the necessary thing rather than the hard of doing the wrong thing. Those were different. She'd learned the difference recently. The shareholder meeting today is taking place because some of you have reasonably asked whether a CEO who created the conditions that allowed this conspiracy to develop should continue in that role. She looked around the room. That's a fair question. I'm not going to argue against it or minimize it. What I'm going to do is tell you what I believe the answer is, and then let you make your decision. She picked up the remote on the table and clicked once. Behind her, the display screen came on, showing 2 images side by side. On the left was a still frame from the Sterling Crest's external camera footage Travis, on the sidewalk, with Sabrina behind him, 3 people on the ground. On the right was the document Marcus had compiled, a timeline. 3 reports filed. 3 reports buried, the routing field exploit, server hardware, the 13 months of communications between Darren and Lusk. This is what oversight failure looks like, she said, gesturing to the right side. And this, she gestured to the left, is what happened when oversight failure meets someone who kept doing the right thing anyway, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. Turned off the display. I have spent the past 10 days understanding something I should have understood before I needed a crisis to teach it to me, she said. The people in this company who are quietest are not the people who have the least to say. They are frequently the people who have learned that saying things doesn't produce results, which is usually a failure of the systems above them, not a failure of their judgment. She paused. I'm going to fix the systems, and I'm going to fix the way I operate within them. Put her hands on the table. I'm asking you to let me do that work. Not because I've earned it by what I've said today, I haven't. I'm asking you to let me do it because I believe the company is worth doing it for, and because the people who've given years of their lives to this place deserve a leadership that takes the lesson seriously. She straightened. If after hearing everything you conclude that someone else should lead this company through what comes next, I will accept that decision and facilitate the cleanest possible transition I can. But I want you to make that decision knowing exactly what I'm telling you. I understand what I did wrong, and I won't do it the same way again. She sat down. The room stayed quiet for a moment that was longer than most quiet moments. Then Clara Vance said, I'd like to propose we open the floor to questions before any formal discussion. Questions ran for an hour and 40 minutes. Some of them were hostile, which was appropriate. A shareholder named Dennis Farrow, who held a significant stake and who had built his position over 12 years, had questions that were less questions than structured arguments for why a CEO who had been this blind to internal fraud had forfeited the right to ask for continued confidence. He was articulate and not wrong about several things, and Sabrina answered his arguments directly without deflecting them or trying to locate their weak points. Some questions were procedural: what the legal exposure looked like, whether the merger with Ardmore was still viable, what the remediation timeline for the security infrastructure looked like. Marcus answered most of these from his seat beside her, concise and well documented, which was what 40 years of legal experience produced. Clara asked one question. In the middle of the session that nobody else had asked, who is Travis Hollowell now? What is his role? Sabrina said, that's being finalized this week. Clara said, what does finalized mean? It means I made him an offer, and he hasn't fully accepted it yet, Sabrina said. And I want to do it right, which means not rushing it. Clara nodded once. She didn't say anything else, but her expression said she approved of the answer, which mattered to Sabrina more than most things in the room that afternoon. At the end of the session, Farrow called for a confidence vote. It was informal shareholder advisory, not legally binding on the board, but it would carry weight, and everyone in the room knew it. Count was conducted by show of hands in 2 rounds, those who supported continued leadership under Sabrina and those who did not. The first round 41 hands, the second 9. 13 shareholders abstained, including Pemberton, who was present but who had not spoken, and who kept his hands in his lap throughout both counts. Sabrina noted it without making anything of it publicly. There would be time for Pemberton separately. After the meeting, when most people had filed out and the room was down to Marcus, Audrey, Clara, and 2 other board members who were staying for a follow-up conversation, Clara came to stand beside Sabrina at the window. Chicago was laid out below them in the late afternoon light, the lake visible at the eastern edge of it, that particular blue-gray that came with October. You should know, Clara said, that I was prepared to vote against you this morning if your opening had gone differently. I know, Sabrina said. How did you know? Because that's what I would have done. She looked at the lake. You needed to see whether I understood the problem. If I'd come in with my defense prepared and my lawyers talking, it would have told you everything. Clara was quiet for a moment, the employee, the driver. The situation with the reports. Yes, that's the part that will be studied, Clara said. Not admiringly, more like a doctor noting the diagnostic significance of a symptom. The reporting system. The single point of control problem. It's a governance structure failure that's more common than boards admit. I know, Sabrina said. I'm going to make it impossible for it to happen at this company again.
How?
Independent reporting channels. External audit of internal communications intake. A rotation protocol on anyone with administrative access to reporting systems. She paused. And I'm going to stop treating the reporting structure as an IT problem and start treating it as a leadership problem. which is what it is. Clara looked at her for a moment with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether something was sufficient. All right, she said. It was not warm. It was not a ringing endorsement. It was the considered judgment of a woman who had spent 40 years watching companies be led well and badly, and who was prepared, provisionally, to extend the benefit of the doubt to a specific next chapter. That was enough. On Tuesday, Sabrina called Travis. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was available, and the background sound was kitchen noisy. Maisie was home. Bad time, Sabrina said. We're making spaghetti, Travis said. A small voice in the background said something indistinct. Maisie says hi. The spontaneity of it caught Sabrina off guard. Hi, Maisie, she said, to the phone, feeling slightly foolish and not minding it. She wants to know if you like spaghetti, Travis said. Tell her yes. A pause while the message was apparently relayed. The small voice said something else, Travis said. She says that's good, because there's a lot. Sabrina sat at her desk and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. I wanted to tell you that the shareholder vote went 41-9, she said. I'm staying, I heard, he said. Audrey texted me. I also want to formalize the position. When you have time, I have time Thursday, he said, after 4. After 4, she agreed. I'll come to you. You don't have to do that. I know, she said. I want to. A moment of kitchen noise on his end, something sizzling. Maisie asking a question she couldn't make out. Travis's voice saying something brief in response that made Maisie laugh. The laugh was bright and unself-conscious, and Sabrina heard it through the phone like a window opening. The position, Travis said. I've been thinking about what you said in Marcus's office, about building it from what matters. And I want to see the language before I sign anything, he said. Not the title, the actual responsibilities. What I'm accountable for and what I'm not. He paused. I don't want a title that means everything to everyone. I want a role that means something specific. That's exactly what I'm building, she said. Why I need you in the room when we draft it. Another pause. The sizzling on his end intensified briefly, then settled. Thursday at 4:30, he said. I'll need to pick Maisie up from Donna first. I'll bring dinner, Sabrina said. If that's all right. Pause this time was different, a beat of recalibration, the sound of a boundary being considered, and then, carefully, adjusted. Maisie likes pizza, he said. I'll get pizza, Sabrina said. She arrived at his apartment on Thursday at 4:45 with a pizza box and a folder under her arm that contained a 4-page draft document Marcus had helped her write, which described a role she had named, in the working title at least, Director of Protective Operations, but which Travis would probably rename because he'd have opinions about the language, and that was fine. The opinions were part of what she was hiring. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building on the north side, the kind of building that had been built in the 70s and had good bones and old radiators, and a stairwell that smelled like someone's cooking. She'd looked up the address through Audrey and walked up the stairs and knocked. Maisie opened the door. She was smaller than Sabrina had expected, with dark hair and 2 uneven pigtails that suggested either she'd done them herself or Travis had done them under time pressure, and a gap where a front tooth had recently been, and the frank, assessing gaze of a child who had decided to form her own opinion before anyone told her what it should be. Are you the one Dad works for? Maisie asked. I am, Sabrina said. Maisie looked at the pizza box, then at Sabrina, then over her shoulder into the apartment. Dad, she called. She's here and she has pizza. Travis appeared from what was presumably the kitchen, wearing a plain gray shirt, and the expression of a man who had just realized his daughter had opened the door ahead of him. Maisie, we talked about checking first. I looked through the peephole, Maisie said, with the confidence of someone who has technically followed the rule. It was her. Sabrina looked at Travis. Travis looked at the ceiling briefly. Come in, he said. The apartment was small and clean in the way that single-parent homes are clean. The surfaces that mattered were clear, the floor was navigable, and the evidence of an 8-year-old's existence was concentrated in specific zones rather than distributed everywhere. There was a drawing on the refrigerator held up by a magnet shaped like an Illinois, and Sabrina could see it was a figure that was probably Travis, rendered in the particular proportional style of children who draw heads larger than bodies, with what appeared to be a car behind him. She draws a lot, Travis said, noticing her look. I can see that. Sabrina set the pizza on the kitchen table. What is he doing in this one? Standing in front of our old car, Maisie said, appearing beside her hip. Before we got the new one. I made it when he was at work one time. She considered the drawing for a moment. His hands are wrong. I think they look fine, Sabrina said. They're too small, Maisie said. He has bigger hands. Travis put plates on the table and they ate spaghetti pizza that Maisie had advocated for, and which was, objectively, not the best pizza available in Chicago, but which Maisie ate with the total conviction of someone who has selected correctly, and which Sabrina ate because she was hungry and because the situation called for eating without complaint, which was not difficult. Maisie talked through most of dinner. She talked about her teacher, whose name was Mrs. Callan, and who had a class hamster named Butterscotch, and who had given Maisie's presentation a very good grade, and who sometimes let students read ahead if they finished the regular work, which Maisie frequently did. Talked about her friend Priya, who was going to be a veterinarian, and her friend Devin, who said he was going to be a race car driver, but Maisie thought this was unlikely because Devin got scared on roller coasters. She talked about what it would be like to have a dog, which was apparently an ongoing conversation in the household that had reached no resolution. Travis listened and answered, and occasionally steered the conversation away from the dog subject with the practiced redirection of someone who had visited this territory many times. He ate his pizza and drank water and was, in the ordinary domestic context of his own kitchen table, almost entirely different from the person who had walked out from behind that concrete pillar in the Sterling Crest garage. Not small or just differently visible. The same qualities present in a different register. After dinner, Maisie disappeared to do homework, which she had announced with the air of someone bearing an inconvenient but inevitable burden, and Travis poured coffee from a pot he'd made before they sat down, and Sabrina opened the folder on the kitchen table between them. They went through the draft for an hour and 20 minutes. Travis read it twice, the second time with a pen making marks. His comments were specific and structural. He struck a section that gave him authority over the company's general communications monitoring, because it was too broad and invited the same single point of control problem Darren had exploited. He added language around independent audit reporting. He changed the title, as she'd anticipated, from Director of Protective Operations to something more specific and more honest about the scope. Head of Security Architecture, she read. Not security operations? Operations means day-to-day, he said. That's manageable. But what broke here wasn't the operations. It was the structure. The way the whole thing was designed and who was accountable for it. He looked at the document. That's what needs oversight. And that's what I can actually give you. All right, she said. Also this clause, he pointed. The one about operational deployments. She read it. The section about field situations. Like the garage. I don't want a clause that requires me to seek authorization before acting in a threat situation, he said. Not because I'm not accountable, I'm accountable for everything I do. But because the value I bring in those moments depends on not having a decision tree between what I see and what I do. She looked at him. I trust your judgment. I know you do right now, he said. But this document is going to exist after right now, and someone reading it in 3 years shouldn't find a clause that could be interpreted to require me to hesitate. It was the kind of long view thinking that she associated with Marcus, the ability to see how a document would read not just in the moment it was signed, but in the moments that followed. Pulled the clause and marked the section. They worked through the remaining pages. Maisie emerged once from her room to ask Travis a question about multiplication, that Travis answered without looking at the document, which made Sabrina realize that the division of his attention was not divided. He was entirely in the kitchen with his daughter, and entirely reviewing the document. And this was simply how he operated, present in multiple places, because all of them mattered. 7:30, Travis put the pen down. The 4 o'clock condition, he said, is in the document, Sabrina confirmed. She turned to the last page and showed him the clause. 4 o'clock is 4 o'clock. It's non-negotiable, and it doesn't require explanation or notice. He read it. Read it again. She watched him read it, and what was on his face was not relief, exactly. It was more like the careful assessment of someone who has been told something that matters, and is deciding whether they believe it. It's not a gesture, she said. I wrote it in because I meant it when I said it at the garage, and I want it on record that I meant it. Travis set the document down. He looked at the refrigerator with the drawing on it, the 2 small hands, and the car and the large head that was supposed to be him. My daughter, he said, is the reason I left the work I was doing before this. He said it quietly, not performing it. Not because I couldn't do it anymore. Because she needed me to be findable, to be the kind of present that you can count on. He paused. The work I'm going to do for you, some of it is going to be serious. Some of it is going to take everything I have. But when I'm done with it at 4 o'clock, I'm done with it. He looked at Sabrina. She doesn't carry any of it home with her. That's the line. I understand, Sabrina said. I know you think you do, he said. Not unkindly. You're right, she said. I probably don't fully understand yet, but I'm going to try, and this document is me trying formally. She paused. And if I get it wrong along the way, I expect you to tell me directly. Not through Audrey. Not through Marcus, directly. He held her gaze. I will. I know, she said. She picked up the pen and signed the document where it said CEO, Westbrook Capital Strategies. She slid it across the table. Travis looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up the pen. His signature was plain and unhurried, first name, last name, no flourish. Pen went back on the table. Sabrina extended her hand across the table, and Travis shook it, and the handshake was the same as everything else about him, direct and without performance and complete. From Maisie's room came the sound of what appeared to be an argument with a multiplication table, specific and frustrated and utterly ordinary. Travis stood and said I should go help her. I know, Sabrina said. She gathered the folder and put on her coat, and Travis walked her to the door, and she stepped out into the stairwell that smelled like someone's cooking and the building's old bones. And 4 o'clock tomorrow, he said. I'll be at the office. 4 o'clock tomorrow, she agreed. She walked down the stairs and out into the Thursday evening, where Chicago was doing what Chicago did in October, pushing cold air off the lake and through the streets and making everything feel slightly more serious than it needed to be. She walked to where her car was parked and sat in it for a moment without starting it. 41-9, a signed document on a kitchen table. A small girl with uneven pigtails asking whether she liked spaghetti. Sabrina started the car. The past 10 days had cost her things. She was still counting the clean story she'd told herself about her own judgment, the simple confidence of a woman who believed she always knew who was worth trusting. Those things were gone, and she did not particularly want them back, because they had been built on a surface that turned out to be thinner than it looked. What was underneath the surface she was discovering was something she could actually work with. She pulled out into the street, and the October evening closed around her. And somewhere 3 floors above her, in a brick building on the north side, Travis Hollowell was sitting beside his daughter, explaining multiplication in the voice of a man who had once done things that would have surprised her completely, and who had chosen this instead every day, because it was the one thing that meant more than all of it. She drove toward the lake, and the light ahead of her was the particular pale gold of late October in Chicago, and she did not look away from it. Winter came to Chicago the way it always did, without asking permission and without particular regard for whether anyone was ready. By the time the first real snow fell in late November, Darren Voss had entered a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office. Raymond Lusk had been formally indicted on 7 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, criminal confinement, and corporate misconduct, and the 3 contractors from the Sterling Crest sidewalk had pled out to reduce charges in exchange for testimony that filled in the operational details of a plan that had been 14 months in the building. The legal machinery moved the way legal machinery always moves, steadily, heavily, with the grinding patience of a system that is not designed for speed but is, in its own imperfect way, designed for thoroughness. Gerald Pemberton resigned from the board in early November, before anyone asked him to, through a letter that his attorney sent to Marcus, and which cited personal reasons in the careful language of someone who has been told exactly which words to use. Diane Greaves hired a different attorney, cooperated with the investigation's preliminary inquiry, and was ultimately not charged. The forensic communications established that she had received information from Lusk, but had not been informed of the criminal elements of what he was doing, a distinction that her attorney had argued vigorously, and that the investigators had ultimately accepted, though not without reservation. She remained on the board in a diminished capacity for another 6 weeks before submitting her own resignation in December without fanfare. The Ardmore financial merger closed in January. Not on the original terms, 3 weeks of intensive renegotiation in November had produced a revised structure that was, in some respects, better than what had been on the table before the Sterling Crest morning. Chaos had, paradoxically, clarified things. Ardmore's leadership had been watching how Sabrina handled the crisis, and what they'd seen had adjusted their assessment of her in ways that worked in her favor at the table. Patterson, Audrey's contact from Ardmore's legal team, told Marcus in a post-closing conversation that the moment the board vote numbers came out, 41-9 had been the moment their CEO had said, internally, that the deal was still worth doing. The number told them something. Patterson said. A CEO who survives that kind of week with that kind of margin isn't running on title. She's running on something else. Marcus relayed this to Sabrina, who filed it away without making much of it. She had stopped measuring herself by the assessments of people deciding whether she was worth doing business with. It was not that those assessments didn't matter, they did, in the practical mechanics of running a company, but they had stopped being the primary number she checked. Travis spent the first 6 weeks in the new role doing what he'd done in the 14th floor conference room on his first day back, working through the existing systems with patient, methodical attention, finding the gaps, mapping the remedies. He brought in 2 additional people, both vetted through connections she didn't ask about and didn't need to, because the vetting itself was part of what she'd hired him to do, and the 3 of them rebuilt the security architecture from the server room outward, replacing what Darren had corrupted, and fixing what Darren had exploited, and installing what should have been there before any of it. The independent reporting channel went live in early December. It was not a complicated system, intentionally so. Travis had argued, in the meeting where they finalized the design, that complexity was itself a barrier, and that the whole point of what had failed before was that the path between an employee who saw something wrong and the people who needed to hear about it had too many points where one person's bad faith could block the signal. The new system had one principle. Any employee at any level could submit a concern directly to an external ethics board that reported to a committee of non-executive board members, bypassing the entire internal management chain if they chose. It was encrypted. It was anonymous if the submitter wanted it to be. And it was audited quarterly by a third-party firm, whose contract was held not by the company's security division, but by the board's audit committee, so that no single internal actor could compromise it. At the launch meeting, a senior analyst named Kevin Marsh, who had been with the company for 7 years and who rarely spoke in meetings of more than 8 people, asked a question that stopped the room. If someone had submitted through this channel a year ago, would it have reached you? Sabrina looked at him. Yes, she said. It would have. But the old channel was wrong, she said. Not poorly designed. Wrong. I designed it around trust without accountability, and that's a different kind of wrong. She paused. Kevin, if you have something to submit right now, you can submit it through this channel, and it will reach the ethics board within 24 hours. Not me. Not my office. The board. Kevin said he didn't have anything to submit right now, but his expression said he appreciated the directness of the answer, which was its own kind of result. After the meeting, Travis found her in the corridor. Kevin Marsh, he said. I know, she said. I should have known his name before today. Probably, Travis said. But you know it now. It was not generous, exactly. Travis was not built for generosity in the sense of offering more than what was accurate. But it was fair, which she had come to understand was actually the more valuable thing. A person who told you the true version of where you stood was more useful than a person who made you feel better about a version that wasn't quite right. She was surrounded by fewer people like that than she'd thought. Before all of this, she was working on that too. Maisie lost the second front tooth in November and gained it back in the form of a school Christmas pageant role that she described to Sabrina at length during a Saturday afternoon in early December when Travis had brought her to the office because Donna was visiting her sister and there were documents that needed signatures, and he had, with the practical resignation of a single father, simply incorporated both requirements into the same trip. Sabrina had not planned to spend 40 minutes hearing about the Christmas pageant. She had planned to sign the documents and go back to the quarterly review she was behind on. What happened instead was that Maisie sat in the chair across from Sabrina's desk and told her, with the comprehensive narrative detail of a child who has been rehearsing the story in her head about Mrs. Callan's casting process, about the role Maisie had wanted and the role she'd received, about the rehearsal schedule, and about the costume, which involved a specific shade of blue that Maisie felt had not been replicated accurately by the fabric her father had found at the craft store. He bought the wrong blue, Maisie said. I told him it was the wrong blue. What did he say? Sabrina asked. He said blue is blue. What do you say? Maisie looked at her with the expression of a child encountering a kindred spirit. It's not the same blue, she said. Sabrina looked at Travis, who was leaning in the doorway with the expression of a man who has had this conversation several times and remains unconvinced by the premise. I can find the right blue, Sabrina said. Travis said, you don't have to do that. I know exactly what fabric store, Sabrina said. I used to make costumes in college. I know what she's describing. A pause. Travis looked at Maisie, who was looking at Sabrina with the sudden complete attention of a child who has just upgraded an assessment. "This weekend," Maisie said. Sabrina checked her calendar. She had 2 things Saturday morning, one of which could move. "Saturday afternoon," she said. Maisie turned to Travis. "She knows what blue it is," she said, as though this settled a long-standing dispute. Travis looked at the ceiling briefly, then at Sabrina. His expression was the one she'd started to recognize as what happened when he was trying to decide whether to let something happen or redirect it, and had decided to let it happen. "Saturday afternoon," he said. They went Saturday afternoon. The 3 of them, which was not something any of them had planned, but which became, in the way that unplanned things sometimes do, entirely natural. Maisie, between them on the sidewalk, with her decisive opinions about fabric, and Travis with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the patient attention of a father who had long ago accepted that his daughter's certainty about specific blues was not a negotiating position. Sabrina found the fabric. It was, in fact, a specific blue more teal than royal, with a slight sheen that would read better under stage lights than the flat fabric Travis had found, and Maisie held it against her arm and looked up at Sabrina with an expression of profound vindication. "That's it," she said. "I know," Sabrina said. Travis looked at the fabric. He looked at his daughter's face. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. They had hot chocolate afterward because it was December in Chicago, and there was a place 2 blocks from the fabric store that Maisie knew about with the authority of someone who has done seriouser research on the subject. Travis ordered black coffee and sat across from them in the small warm space, while Maisie explained to Sabrina the full dramatic arc of the Christmas pageant, including the parts of other people's roles that she felt had been miscast. Sabrina listened. Travis watched Sabrina listen. He watched the way she gave Maisie her full attention, without the performance of paying attention, not the exaggerated engagement of adults who are humoring a child, but the genuine attention of someone who found the conversation worth having. Maisie registered the difference. Children always register the difference, even when they lack the vocabulary for it. On the sidewalk outside afterward, while Maisie ran ahead to look at something in a shop window, Travis said, "Thank you." "Fabric?" "For listening to her," he said. "She talks a lot when she trusts someone." Sabrina looked at Maisie at the shop window, her breath making small clouds in the December air. "She's easy to listen to," she said. "She's very certain about things." "She gets that from her mother," Travis said. He said it without flinching, which she understood meant he had arrived at a place, with it not that it didn't hurt, but that the hurt had been integrated into something he could carry without being stopped by it. "She's lucky to have you," Sabrina said. Travis was quiet for a moment. "Some days I'm better at it than others," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her that wasn't directly related to work or threat assessment, and she recognized it as such. She didn't try to improve on it or reassure him past it. She just let it be what it was, a true statement from a man who did not often make them about himself. "I think that's what good parenting looks like," she said. "From the outside." He looked at her. I know I don't have to say it," she said. "I'm saying it because it's true." Maisie had turned around and was beckoning them toward the shop window, with the impatient energy of a child who has found something worth looking at and cannot understand why the adults have not already arrived. They walked toward her. Their shoulders were close, in the way that people's shoulders get close, on a narrow December sidewalk, and neither of them moved apart, and neither of them noted it. And the evening came down around Chicago, with its particular cold clarity, and the 3 of them stood at the window looking at whatever Maisie had found worth showing them. The trial for Raymond Lusk began in March and lasted 11 weeks. Sabrina testified on the 4th day. She had been in courtrooms before corporate litigation, depositions, the ordinary friction of business conducted at scale, but not like this. The courtroom had the specific charge stillness of a room where something is being decided permanently, and the weight of it was different from a boardroom or a shareholder meeting. In those rooms, decisions could be revisited. In this one, they couldn't. She testified for 4 hours. She answered questions about the merger structure, about Darren's authority, about the morning at the Sterling Crest, about the board meeting and the shareholder vote and the forensic documentation. Lusk's attorney cross-examined her for 90 minutes with the practiced aggression of someone paid to find the inconsistency that unravels everything. And there was no such inconsistency, because she told the same story she had told from the beginning, not the polished version, but the true version, including the parts where her own judgment had failed. At one point, Lusk's attorney said, Isn't it possible that the security failures you've described were the result of your own management choices rather than any conspiracy by my client? Sabrina said, my management failures created conditions that made the conspiracy possible. That's not the same as saying there was no conspiracy. Both things are true. The attorney paused. That was not the answer he'd been looking for. He moved to the next question. Travis was in the gallery. She'd told him he didn't need to be there. He'd said he'd be there. He sat in the third row behind the prosecution table, and she saw him when she took her seat in the witness stand. And the seeing him did something that she had stopped trying to classify it, didn't make her less nervous, because nothing was going to make her less nervous in that room. But it changed the quality of the nervousness from something isolating to something manageable. Testified. She told the truth. She left the courtroom afterward, and Travis was waiting in the corridor. How was it? She said. You were straight, he said. Part about your own failures, the attorney expected you to defend yourself. You didn't. Because I wasn't defending myself, she said. I was telling the jury what actually happened, I know, he says. That's what I mean. They walked out of the building into a March afternoon that was almost warm, the kind of day that Chicago produces in early spring like an apology for February, and they walked for 2 blocks without particular direction, before Sabrina realized they were walking instead of going somewhere, and didn't stop. Raymond Lusk was convicted in May on 5 of the 7 counts. Darren Voss, whose cooperation agreement had included a guilty plea on 3 counts, received a reduced sentence that his attorney had negotiated over the winter and that Marcus described as appropriate, given the cooperation's value to the prosecution. The hired contractors served varying terms. The offshore accounts were frozen, and the forensic accounting team traced enough of the money to satisfy the court's asset forfeiture requirements. It was not a clean ending. Legal proceedings rarely produced clean endings, they produced documented ones, which was different. The verdict closed some things and left others permanently unresolved. The question of what Darren had been thinking across 4 years of competent, trusted service before the corruption took hold, the question of how many other people in how many other companies were doing the same thing in slower, quieter ways that hadn't yet been found. Sabrina sat with those questions. She didn't try to answer them. Some things didn't have answers, only acknowledgments. In June, she went back to the Sterling Crest. It was not for work. There was a charity event that she'd been asked to attend, a fundraiser for a workforce development organization that she'd donated to for 3 years without attending their events, and which she'd decided, in the general reorganization of her habits, to actually show up for this time. Sterling Crest was their venue. Travis drove her. She had not asked him to. He was no longer her driver. He was her head of security architecture, and driving her was not in the scope of his role. But he'd been at the office when she left, and he'd said he had a reason to be in that part of the city anyway, and she'd said he didn't have to, and he'd said he knew that, and they'd arrived at the Sterling Crest at 7:15 in a car that was not the same Mercedes, but felt, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, like the same trip. He pulled up to the entrance, and she got out, and they stood for a moment on the sidewalk. The revolving doors were the same doors. The doorman had changed different faces in white gloves, the same practiced professional courtesy. The October light was June light now, warm instead of sharp, and the street smelled like summer beginning instead of autumn ending. She looked at the entrance. Travis looked at it too, with the automatic assessment of a man who still checked rooms before other people entered them, and always knew where the exits were, and probably always would. Because some things that are trained deep enough become structural rather than habitual. She had come to understand this about him, that the SEAL instincts were not something he turned on and off, but something that existed as a constant low-level background process. The way her financial modeling instincts existed in her own thinking. Neither of them could fully step outside what they'd built themselves into. Do you think about that morning? She asked. Not the way you might expect, he said. What do you think about when you think about it? He was quiet for a moment. The traffic moved behind them. A couple came out of the revolving doors and walked past them on the sidewalk. I think about what I should have done differently, he said. Not the sidewalk. Before the sidewalk. There were better ways to make sure the reports reached you. I was working within the system because it seemed like the right approach, but the system had already been compromised. He paused. I knew something was wrong with the infrastructure. I should have found a way around Darren's control of the intake portal, gone directly to Marcus, or found a board contact. You didn't know Marcus. I could have found him, Travis said. It would have taken 2 days. She looked at him. You're saying you blame yourself. I'm saying I had more options than I used, he said. That's different from blame. It's just what's true. She thought about what it meant that this was how he processed it, not with guilt, not with self-exoneration, but with the same direct assessment he applied to everything else. Looking at what was, and what could have been different, and accepting the difference without drama. I fired you, she said, in front of those people. Yes. I've thought about that morning more times than I can count, she said. I keep getting stuck on the same thing. You weren't surprised. When I said you were done, you weren't surprised. Travis looked at the entrance. I was disappointed, he said. Not surprised. I'd watched you operate for 18 months. I knew how the room was reading. A pause. I knew Darren had shaped how you saw me. I let him. You did, Travis said. But you also came to a garage on Ashland Avenue yourself. And that mattered. She had not fully understood, until this moment, how much those two things existed together in his accounting of her, the failure and the repair, held side by side without one canceling the other. Most people she'd dealt with in business operated in one of two modes. They either minimize failures or they use them as permanent debts. Travis did neither. He just kept the whole picture. She thought about the things she'd learned in the past 8 months that she could not have learned any other way. About the difference between confidence and integrity, and how easy it was to mistake one for the other when you weren't paying attention. About the people who existed at the edges of your professional vision, reliable, quiet, present, doing their jobs with a completeness that you never registered until it was gone. About the cost of building systems around trust without verification, and the equally real cost of building systems so armored against betrayal that no trust could survive inside them. The balance between those two things was not a fixed point. It was something you had to keep finding, every day, in every decision, about who you listened to and how you listened. She had not finished learning. She knew that. She would probably still be learning it in 10 years, in different configurations, with different people, in rooms she hadn't walked into yet. Crisis had not produced wisdom, it had produced the beginning of the conditions under which wisdom became possible, which was a different and less satisfying thing, but also the honest thing. Travis looked at her. The front entrance question, he said. She looked at him. He scanned the entrance with the brief, unhurried attention of someone who does this, naturally, cataloging positions and sightlines and the evening crowd without appearing to. Then he stopped. His expression did the thing it sometimes did, not quite a smile, but the geography of one. Tonight you're safe, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she took his hand. Not as a statement, not as a gesture for anyone else. Just because they were standing on that sidewalk where everything had broken and where everything had begun, and because the 8 months between that morning and this evening had been the hardest work she'd ever done, and he had been part of it in ways that went beyond what either of them had signed on a kitchen table in October, and because some things are simply true and don't require more than the doing of them. Travis looked at their hands. He didn't pull back. He stood there with the same steadiness he stood everywhere, the stillness that had stopped being stillness to her and had become simply the shape of how he was grounded in a way that didn't require anything outside itself to stay upright. They walked inside. The Sterling Crest lobby was the same lobby. The imported flowers, the old money smell, the doormen with their white gloves, the 42 floors of glass catching the evening light and throwing it back in every direction. The same chandelier, the same marble, the same view of the elevator bank, where Travis had handed over his key fob on a cold October morning, because she had told him he was done. She walked through it differently now. Not with less purpose, with different purpose. The version of Sabrina Westbrook, who had crossed this lobby 8 months ago, had been carrying an enormous amount of carefully maintained certainty, and most of that certainty had turned out to be the wrong shape for the reality it was supposed to describe. What she carried now was less comfortable and more durable, the knowledge of her own capacity for failure, and the equal knowledge that failure was not the end of anything unless you decided it was. There are things you cannot learn about yourself until the conditions for learning them arrive, uninvited, and rearrange everything. She had learned that she was capable of humiliating a man who was trying to help her. She had learned that she was also capable of walking into a room full of people with the authority to end her career and telling them the exact shape of that failure without softening it. Both of those things were true. She was both of those people, and the only variable was what she did with the distance between them. She had also learned, in the quieter and perhaps more important way that learning sometimes happens, that the people who matter most in any structure are not always the ones who make themselves visible. They are sometimes the ones who show up before anyone else is awake and remove a problem from a wheel well, and try 3 times through proper channels to tell someone about it, and stay long enough to make sure she was safe, even after she'd fired them in public, and then go home to make scrambled eggs and cut an apple into thin slices because a little girl preferred them that way. Travis had once believed that the life he was protecting was the one inside a specific perimeter, the apartment on the north side, Donna at 415, the school pageants, spaghetti pizza, the drawing on the refrigerator with the 2 small hands. He had built walls around it, because walls were what he knew how to build, and because the things outside the walls had cost him too much before. He had been right that those things inside deserved protecting. He had been wrong that protecting them required keeping everyone else outside. Some people, it turned out, could be let in without the walls coming down. Some people earned their way, and not through grand demonstration, but through the slower, quieter work of proving, over and over, that they would tell you the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient, even when you hadn't asked for it, even when you might fire them for it. Maisie had decided independently, somewhere around the day of the fabric store, that Sabrina was one of those people. She had not announced this decision. She had communicated it through the progressive disclosure of an 8-year-old's interior world, the Christmas pageant specifics, the multiplication frustrations, the ongoing dog question, the drawings she left on the kitchen table when Sabrina came over on Saturday afternoons that were increasingly addressed to both of them. Travis had watched his daughter make this decision with the particular care of a father who understands that his child's trust is the thing he protects most carefully, and he had not intervened, because Maisie was not wrong. Outside the charity event's main room, in the quiet corridor before the evening began, Travis stopped. "What?" Sabrina said. "Nothing," he said. He paused. It was a different kind of pause than his working pauses, less assessment, more something else. "Maisie wants to know if you're coming to the spring concert." "When is it?" "3rd week of May. I'll be there," she said. He nodded. He started toward the event room door. "Travis." He turned. She looked at him in the corridor of the Sterling Crest Hotel, 8 months from that morning, and she thought about all the words she'd assembled and disassembled in the time between then and now, the apologies, the contracts, the testimony, the documents on the kitchen table, the conversations in garages and offices and courtrooms and December sidewalks. All the ways she'd tried to say the things that mattered, and all the times the arrangement had come apart before she could say them. "I know I still owe you," she said, "for what I did in that lobby." Travis looked at her steadily. "You paid it," he said. "When Ashland Avenue," he said. "You came yourself." She held that for a moment. Then she nodded. They walked through the door together, into the noise and light of an evening that had nothing to do with conspiracies or courtrooms or October sidewalks, just people in a room, raising money for something, worth raising money for, the ordinary good work of the world continuing in its imperfect, persistent way. This is what nobody tells you about the big moments, the crisis, the betrayal, the public failure, and the harder private reckoning that follows. Nobody tells you that the resolution isn't a moment. It's an accumulation. It's a fabric store on a December afternoon, and a signed document on a kitchen table, and 41 hands raised in a conference room, and a woman going to a school concert in May. It's the slow, unspectacular work of becoming someone who deserves the trust you're asking for. Sabrina Westbrook had nearly lost everything that mattered on a Tuesday morning in October, because she had confused the appearance of trustworthiness with the substance of it. She had learned the difference the hard way, which is almost always the only way it's learned. Travis Hollowell had built a life around protecting the one small, irreplaceable thing left to him after the life before had cost too much. He had been right that it needed protecting. He had discovered, carefully and against his own resistance, that protection and openness were not the opposites he'd believed them to be, that some things grew stronger when you let the right people in, rather than weaker. And Maisie, who was 8 years old and certain about blues, and had decided without consultation that the right people were trustworthy until they proved otherwise, and that spaghetti pizza was an appropriate dinner for any occasion, was probably the wisest person in any of their lives, and would remain so for the foreseeable future. The evening ended late, the way good evenings do. They drove home through a Chicago night that was warm enough to have the window down, and Maisie was waiting at Donna's and fell asleep in the back seat on the way home, one shoe off, The specific dead weight of a child who has decided sleep is more important than the conversation happening in the front seat. Sabrina sat in the front seat, Travis drove. The city moved past the windows, all its light and noise and permanent, indifferent vitality. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed saying, which was its own kind of arrival, the place where two people have talked through enough of the hard things that the quiet between them finally means rest instead of distance. Somewhere on the north side, Travis said, long day. Long 8 months, Sabrina said. Yeah, a pause. Worth it, though. She looked out the window at Chicago going past, and the lake visible for a moment between buildings, that dark water that was always there at the edge of everything. Yeah, she said. Worth it.